All right. Well, thanks for joining us for the eighth SLiTHER. Our speaker today is Santiago Toledo from St. Edward's University. And he's going to be telling us about some alternative grading styles and schemes. And I know I'm looking forward to it. So I've talked long enough. It's all yours.
Thank you, Chip. And thank you to everybody at Viper and for specifically Carrie Stone for the invitation to this SLiTHER. I really appreciated it, and I'm glad to be here with all of you. So hopefully today we get a little bit of a chance to talk about grading systems and alternative grading structures that hopefully is something you're interested in. So let's get started. Let me see, I have to share my screen. There we go. Everybody can see it now, is that correct? Thank you. Awesome. So just giving you a little bit of my background. So I'm an associate professor here at St. Edward's University. This is an HSI located in Austin, Texas, Hispanic Serving Institution. We have approximately 3,600 students, primarily undergraduate with some master's programs. My classes range in size from upper division classes, about 10 students, to lower division classes in 32, 35 students. So that's sort of the background of how I come about doing this. I'm not formally trained as a chemical educator. I'm a practitioner. So that's sort of where I come from to this sort of picture. So, and I started stumbling upon the idea of thinking about course design in my second year of teaching back in 2011. After 2 years of teaching, frustration started mounting. And I had a really good friend in the Department of Economics at Texas Lutheran University, a place that I taught before. And between him and I, we developed everything that you'll see today. So it was a really wonderful collaboration between two people that were incredibly frustrated with teaching and how things were going in our classes. And we sort of came about with some of these ideas that you'll see here based on ideas from the literature. But I wanted to see if there was a chance that we can quickly go around and maybe tell me your academic area and what experience or interest do you have in alternative grading systems, if that's possible. And I don't know how we go around in order, but I'll just go with what I see in my screen. Maybe we can start with Anthony Fernandez.
Hi. I teach at Merrimack College in North Andover, Mass, and I have no experience with alternative grading systems. I have looked into outcomes-based grading previously, but I've never tried to implement it.
Thank you. Chip?
I am Chip Notaro from Lafayette College, and I think Anthony covered everything I would say.
Thank you. I'm trying to see my names. I don't see the names anymore. Give me a second. Oh. Somebody wants to, I don't know what happened with my names. I used to see the names and now I don't see them.
I'm Matthew Bork from Rockford University, and I'm on the same boat. I've been interested, but haven't had some time to jump into it.
Thank you. And I guess we can just jump in as we go. Thank you.
I can go next. I'm Kyle Grice from DePaul University. And I've similarly have not done it yet, but I've been curious about it, and I've heard people talk about things like ungrading that I'd like to learn more about.
Thank you.
Taylor Haynes from Cal Poly. One of my colleagues in the chemistry department has tried using specifications-based grading and has talked about it a little bit. So I'm aware of it, but haven't used it myself.
I'm Janet Schrank from...
go ahead.
Janet Schrank from UMass Lowell, and I'm in the same boat pretty much as everyone else, you know. I'm here to learn.
Thank you.
And Santiago, you know that we at Lewis are starting to do what you do. So today was our first day on the job, so we'll see how it goes.
Exciting. That's great.
Hey everyone, I'm Fair Ho. I'm from Western Oregon University. I'm also not familiar with alternative grading. I have never done that in my classes, but I'm very curious to learn about it.
Thank you.
This is Fan. I'm from Reed College, and yeah, I've heard about alternative grading, but I've not tried it and would like to know more. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I think you're muted. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
My name is Mary. I'm from Edmonds College near Seattle. And, you know, the same as everybody has said, I'm interested in this from a kind of equity and harm reduction standpoint, and also got involved in this through a kind of a training course we did over the summer. And I read this quite interesting article in Life Science Education on this topic. So that got me interested.
Thank you.
Does anybody else want to share? That's just about everyone that's here.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for that. And I hope to give you a little bit of an overview. There'll be a lot of details, but I'm also really excited to hopefully continue the conversation outside of this forum. Hopefully this is a great starting point for this community to begin talking about, especially the inorganic chemistry community, to think about this. So hopefully at the end of the workshop, I'm going to try to provide you with a little bit of a framework of how I thought about, now reflecting back on the changes that I made in my class, how to go about thinking of designing alternative grading methods. Specifically, I'm going to focus on this idea of how learning outcomes can be centered around your grading specifically, how you can embed mastery incentives in your grading, which are, as somebody mentioned in the introduction, something that can help with students' motivation and, of course, ultimate their retention in the class. And then ultimately, this idea of how can we leverage potentially cognitive levels, things that you can think about from taxonomies of learning, and helping students think a little bit higher order thinking as you think about your grading. So hopefully we'll go through that in the next few minutes here. So I'll tell you a little bit about my motivation, and then we'll talk about the framework itself. So as some of you hopefully agree with some of these reflections, that I thought that grading should be more than this idea of long hours, right? If you talk to most of our colleagues, that's one of the things we dread the most, looking at lab reports for hours and hours, trying to think about how to grade effectively. And then we don't necessarily get the outcome that we want, which is getting the students to read our feedback and then implement that feedback in a successful, hopefully sustainable way. It also should be something that is beyond making students happy or sad, right? This is not about them getting excited to get an A or getting really depressed to get a D. This should be about the students feeling like this number or whatever grade feedback you provide to them has some sort of connection with the actual learning and understanding that they have of the material. This also should not, as I mentioned, cannot be a unidirectional process that we give it to them, they put it in their backpack, and then they shred it, or it never cannot see any light of day. So I think it should be more than that. I also think, based on the work that I've done with learning objectives, I think that this is a really powerful tool in our course design. It's something we have a lot of control over that can actually help students reach a higher level of metacognition, right? So if the feedback is rich and meaningful, they might be able to do something about that and then recognize what they know and what they don't know. And then ultimately, because that's what we want of our students when they graduate, this idea of becoming self-directed learners and be able to do things on their own and learn on their own is also a really important goal that I have for my students. And I think that grading can do that. The way that we go about grading can actually give them a little bit more tools to how to do that better. So I kind of came about this starting with work that I did on learning outcomes in classes. Once I had that established, and I'll go back to that in a second, but once I had that established in my courses, I realized that an interesting way to go about changing the structure of my course was also to start giving students feedback based on how well they achieved the learning objectives for the course. So that's how I stumbled upon standards-based grading or outcomes-based grading. So that type of grading structure, that it's all about providing feedback for students based on how well do they do in those learning objectives. And some features of that grading structure that were useful to me was that the learning objectives were always at the center of the feedback. So it wasn't necessarily about the type of activity the student was doing, but instead about how well did they do with that learning objective. And then this idea that the emphasis on mastery, right? Opportunities to improve was something that was at the core of my philosophy of teaching, and also from an equity standpoint and thinking about that some students just take a little bit longer to get to the end point, right? They have this 14 weeks or a quarter system to get to the end, and that it was not necessarily fair from my perspective to give them a grade and thank them in the first exam of the semester and not give them an opportunity to come out of that hole, which oftentimes ended up being detrimental for certain population of students that just never saw themselves as successful in the course. And then, of course, and maybe some of you have already seen this wonderful work by Linda Nilsson, this book, Specifications Grading, landed on our lap because my colleague in economics and I are both married to educators in the K-12 system, and they both were reading this book and they kind of gave it to us. And we were avidly reading things about grading. So this book came across, and it was a wonderful, wonderful book. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I absolutely recommend it. So this is the idea of specifications grading. I think somebody mentioned that, that they were already implementing that potentially in their department. But the thing that stands out to me about this particular grading structure is that we can try to set clear criteria for students to reach in order to meet a standard of learning. So the idea here is to describe what it means to learn in our courses, not what it means to get this point system, but what it means to learn the material. And that's what Nilsson emphasizes. This idea also that it is important that we maybe get away from trying to break our heads over assigning -1, -2, -3 and giving partial credit to students, but instead having high expectations for the students and saying, this is what it means to do it right, and getting away from partial points and maybe giving more meaningful feedback for trying more attempts at getting to that ultimate mastery. Another feature of specs grading is that the students can have some choice. If you're very clear about the expectations of the grading, then the students can actually take some ownership and autonomy into what they actually want to achieve in the classroom. Because oftentimes, you know, we want all of our students to get wonderful grades and to do great. But if that's not what they want, it's not necessarily our job to force them into that, but actually provide them with choices into what level do they want to achieve at, and being really clear about that. And then finally, and it's something that was connected to the outcomes-based grading I mentioned before, is the idea of emphasis on mastery opportunities, right? Opportunities to improve. So when we took those two ideas and combined them together is sort of how we came about with our grading structure. And after reading all of that and doing the work on reflecting on this, we just recognized that we were being incredibly draconian in our classes in terms of not giving students opportunity to get better. We were sort of giving them grades, and they were sort of sinking into a hole, and then they had to dig themselves the entire semester out of that hole. Motivation theory suggests that if the student doesn't feel themselves as capable of being successful in the class, they're not going to succeed. So gradings can actually send a really strong message to students. We realized that a lot of the students that were succeeding in our classes, right, succeeding meaning earning a grade of, let's say, an A or a B, were not necessarily the students that knew the material, but maybe it was students that were able to amass partial points and partial credit from different pools of points that we had provided for them. And then eventually that added up to the right amount of points to get to the next grade level. But there wasn't a connection between learning and the grade that they were receiving. And then finally, we also realized that our students were leaving our classes, our courses, with a number or with a letter grade, and that letter grade was not instructive for them in terms of what they actually knew from the content perspective, moving on to the next semester of their education, which is super important as we go from classes that are building on each other, like Inorganic 1 and 2, Gen Chem 1, Gen Chem 2, and of course, Organic Chemistry and the other subclasses that they might be taking. So that's kind of was our pushing us forward to feel really motivated to change this. And we captured this in an earlier work that we did. It was published in Chemical Education. And I will put the caveat that that was earlier work and that was sort of the original idea that we wanted to talk about. And today what you will see in this description is sort of the version 2.0 of what we actually are using in our classrooms now. So for a second, maybe not 4 minutes, that would be maybe an elongated amount of time, but maybe if we can take maybe 2 to 3 minutes to think about any of these prompts or some of these prompts, just kind of start jotting down some ideas about how you think about incentivizing learning in your classes with your grading structure. How might you be doing incentivizing mastery in your classes? Maybe you do have some mechanisms for you to give students opportunities to improve. And maybe how are you taking advantage of the use of learning objectives to get there? So if you can just think about that, the idea for this prompt is that the next section of the talk is going to be focusing how I sort of specifically implemented each of these things. So maybe thinking about how you're doing it and now reflecting onto how that looks different or the same to what I'm doing. So I'll just do a couple of minutes of, just as reflecting, writing down some ideas, and then we'll come back. So recognizing that's probably not sufficient time, I wanted to use that as our framework to sort of thinking forward, and as we go into the conversation in the Q&A session, how do we think about embedding some of these things in our own grading structures? So the way that I propose as a framework for thinking about alternative grading system and something that worked for me and how I went about doing that, the very first thing is the alignment of the assessments and my grading structure according to learning objectives, moving away from trying to emphasize the task and instead emphasizing the objectives of the course, or like the content objectives for the course. The second thing, and it's kind of a unique feature of the type of system that I use because I use a particular taxonomy of learning, is using cognitive levels as a way to even ramp up the type of feedback that I give to my students. And the third one is, of course, making sure that I have some opportunities for students to do better for mastery at the end of the class. So we'll start with the idea of aligning objectives to grading. So traditional courses that are divided, for example, by percentages, right, where homework is worth 10%, maybe your term exams are worth 60% of your grade, a final exam 20%, some quizzes here and there, and you might have other alternative activities. What we usually do is we kind of assign percentages to each of these tasks, and then students perform on those, and then we average that to eventually give them, with the weighted average, to give them the ultimate grade. Something that is kind of if you're sort of a beginner on the idea of how do I think about alternative grading structures, a pretty straightforward first step transformation is to think about that all of your homeworks, all of your exams, and your quizzes, and anything that you do in your classroom, they're actually internally probably, or maybe sometimes in your case, in some of your cases, maybe already externally mapped to specific learning objectives you have for your students. Right? So a homework you might assign, you already have a clear idea what you want them to achieve, but it's not explicitly mapped. So one simple thing to start trying to do, whether that is internal or actually external, communicating to the students, is to map your homeworks and your exams according to learning objectives. And that type of feedback, let's say that you use it internally, is something that you can now use moving forward in your classes because you know the kinds of things that the students did well and didn't do well, as opposed to a collective average grade, let's say for exam number 1, where everything is sort of brought together. And for the student, if this is made explicit, is also a really good piece of information that tells them, here's how you performed on this type of the content in exam number 1, rather than saying you got a C in the exam. Instead, you said you have a C in the exam, but also in learning objective 1, you basically achieved 80% of success. Is one thing that you can think about embedding objectives in your courses, because I think that intuitively, a lot of instructors that have a lot of experience already are thinking this way. It's just that that kind of distinction is not made explicit yet. The approach that I take is that I use the writing of learning objectives in my classroom using what is called Marzano's taxonomy of learning. This is a revised taxonomy of learning from the more popular Bloom's taxonomy. And I'm an endorser of this taxonomy because when I first came about this work, I try to tackle Bloom's and I try to tackle other alternative revisions to taxonomies. And Marzano's taxonomy was actually the most intuitive taxonomy for me and my colleague when we wanted to sort of think about how to embed cognitive levels within our thinking. So Marzano's taxonomy, really briefly, is not the focus of this talk, but it's sort of divided into these 4 cognitive levels of thinking: retrieval, comprehension, analysis, and knowledge utilization. And it basically scaffolds learning and thinking in a way that you can structure your objectives as well as structure the types of questions that you might be asking students. So the goal of this is that in addition to asking students questions and giving them feedback based on the learning objective, a second layer of feedback that could be provided for students is in the way that of the type of thinking that they're doing. We might all have the experience that a student tells us, I truly understood that concept. I knew it really well, but I just bombed it in the exam. It might be that the student was really good at getting that concept at potentially the retrieval level or the comprehension level, but the exam question was targeted at the analysis level, and that's why the students failed at that attempt. So distinguishing according to cognitive levels in the feedback that we give the students or the types of questions that we ask is also really useful for them as we try to teach them to be learners and independent learners, because they're starting to recognize that not all questions are created equal, and that, you know, sometimes we're targeting a higher level of thinking. And as an instructor, if we have this kind of a framework in place, like the taxonomy of learning, you might be able to decide in which classes you want to target higher order and in which classes you want to kind of stay at lower order, or for what topics do you want to go for higher order and what topics do you want to go to lower order. So this additional layer using Marzano's taxonomy was really useful to us, and I think is a really useful tool when you're thinking about structuring your grading differently. So just to show you, this is sort of what a sample learning objective for my class would look like, where each of the learning objectives is divided according to cognitive level. So we can describe to the students for each topic or each idea in my class, they know exactly what does it mean to succeed at each of the different cognitive levels. This is explicitly made available to students. From a faculty perspective, just to give you a sense, I have 11 learning objectives for my general chemistry course, and between 7 and 9 learning objectives, depending on the semester, for my advanced inorganic course. So just to kind of give you a sense of what a manageable number of learning objectives is for this kind of a structure. And I'll be happy to share more information on the learning objectives. If you just email me directly, I can share that information with you. So what is my approach when I came about restructuring my grading? So everything is focused on the learning objectives. Everything is revolving around the learning objectives. So every class activity, every assignment, any question in the assessments that I ask of them is explicitly mapped to an SLO. And the point for that is that I want them to have a very clear focus of what they're doing on that particular topic. And I want the students to be able to just focus on that content at that time. And I think that absolutely is capable of reducing the cognitive load that students have to encounter when they're encountering material, because they're able to sort of disaggregate content a little bit and say, okay, I'm focused on 1.1 or on 1.2 and stoichiometry, on Lewis acids and bases, whatever, trying to disaggregate that information as much as possible. The feedback that they receive is by learning objective and not by type of assignment necessarily. So I'm trying to call less attention to exams and quizzes and call more attention to the learning objective, so that the focus is a little bit more on the learning. The embedding opportunities for mastery kind of incentives that I put in are known, of course, in the literature to sort of help our students build resilience, be a little bit better about improving their motivation. And in some cases, some studies have shown, and some anecdotal evidence I have, is that it actually tends to improve retention, meaning that students that normally would have qualified as that D-level student that didn't necessarily succeed in the class, they actually might retain longer and eventually succeed. And I'll show you why that might be true. So specifically in my class, I take advantage of the use of tokens, where in the homework, students can use a token, a fake token, for incomplete or submitting no homework. And the idea behind the token system is to let them know that it is more important to me that they try the homework, because it's a formative assessment piece, than they don't try it at all. So the students get no penalty for not completing the homework or for getting it partially proficient, as long as they use one of their tokens for succeeding at the homework eventually. The homework is also graded according to specifications grading, meaning that I say that if you get an 80% in the homework, you get the credit for the homework. I no longer have to fight with students for those 95, 96, 97 when they're trying to fight for those extra points that are often not as meaningful as getting to a robust level of practice with the homework. I decided that if the student gets to 80% in the homework, that is good enough for them to earn the entire credit for the homework. And of course, that has dissipated all the different point grabbing that was happening before, or point claiming that was happening before when I was trying to do a specific point on my homework. My exams are now called a checkpoint. So everything that we do in the class, exam, quizzes, final exam, is just checkpoints for learning. So there's no distinction between that. And part of that was because I wanted to sort of reduce that fear associated with quizzes being lowball, exams being much higher, and then finals being intense and something that you can't even handle. The idea behind that is that hopefully we think about every time we do any assessment is a check of where you are in your understanding. And that's why I call them checkpoints, sort of leveling the field between those types of assessments. The grading of the assessments is done on a pass-fail modality, so there's no partial credit awarded to any of their grading that they receive in their quizzes or in their checkpoints. In any of those, it's just you got it or you didn't. But of course, with feedback, written feedback on the assignment, it's on the assessment itself, so that the students can actually make some changes. And ultimately, students need to recognize that every assessment is an opportunity for them to reach mastery. In my class, the students have up to 3 attempts at succeeding at getting the proficiency with a learning objective. So just to sort of give you a graphical version of what I just talked about, everything is grading according to learning outcomes. There are 3 different tasks that the students have to complete according to any learning outcome: the homework, a comprehension level checkpoint. This is where the taxonomy comes into play, and ultimately an analysis level checkpoint, which is a higher order type of question that the students have to do. Students can retake it up to 3 times. All of the questions that I ask are constructive response, but my colleague in economics whom I developed this work with, he did a lot of multiple choice work, and that also is applicable for those kinds of classes, if that's what's more accessible for your course. From a point value perspective, students earn 0.5 worth of credit for doing the homework, 1.75 for comprehension, and 1.75 for doing the analysis in a 4-point scale. And in the end, the students are just averaged the different points associated with each of the SLOs in the class. As I said, in my general chemistry class, we have 11 learning objectives. A student that does only the homework and doesn't succeed at any of the comprehension or analysis checkpoints cannot pass the class. In my class, a 0.8 corresponds to a D level grade. So a student must begin to do some of the assessments and show some understanding of the content in order to pass the class. Another nice thing about this is that if a student is only performing at the comprehension level and does the homework proficiently, but is really struggling with the analytical type of thinking, the student is only capable of earning, in my class, a C+ level. So I've sort of been able to map what I think of what it means to get a C in my class or an A in my class to the learning that the students are doing and the cognitive level the students is performing at. So if a student cannot be thinking analytically, given that that's an expectation for me in general chemistry, the student cannot get past the C+ level at that point. So I mentioned the token system where the students can use it. And also a lot of you, and I know that from the Viper community, a lot of you are incredibly creative about doing different things in your classes. And some things that you can do in your courses is, for example, some of you might do collaborative learning type of credit that you give your students, participation type of credit, reading the scientific literature. I know it's something that we all do in our community, oral communication type of learning objectives. So this system does not preclude you from doing that, because you can have your learning objectives and then you can have your additional objectives that are associated with your class without necessarily having to compromise on doing only content type material. So just to give you sort of a sample, let's say a student in a grade book, just sort of thinking about this, completes the homework proficiently, tries the checkpoint comprehension level and doesn't get it in the first attempt, and doesn't get it on the second and the first attempt for the analytical either. Comes in the second attempt and then gets the comprehension, but doesn't get the analysis. But in the third attempt, they don't have to try this again. In my class, students don't have to do this again if they already have proficiency. And in the analysis level, they come in and actually do it well. So in the end, a student that might have been sort of failing, if you want to think about it from in certain aspects of the semester as they went through, eventually ended up with full credit in the particular learning objective because they had these multiple opportunities to succeed. Additionally, another thing, level type of feedback that you can see is that this is the kind of look that the students can be seeing, right, in their little in sort of a grading structure that I provide for them. You have these bar graphs that sort of show them, well, analytically you're struggling, but in comprehension you're doing well, and it kind of sort of gives them a little bit of a visual, a little bit more information about what they're doing, what they're not doing. From a global perspective, from an instructor perspective, you can kind of see your entire class and their level of proficiency according to learning objective. And this is incredibly useful when it comes to course redesign and course evaluation and assessment from your own purposes or departmental purposes. Let's say you're teaching Gen Chem with a collective of people. You can kind of start comparing and contrasting the performance of students according to learning objective and according to cognitive level, and then begin making adaptations and changes according to the challenges that you see in your class. So to me, my argument is that even if it's just mapping the content according to objectives, you can do a lot more with that information that you're now having in front of you just because of the mapping. just really briefly, and I don't want to spend too much time because I want to get to the Q&A section. This is sort of an example in my general chemistry class of what happens with students in their first attempt versus the end of the course. There's a clear improvement in terms of how they do, as well as there's a distinction between the proficiency that students achieve at comprehension level versus analysis, and this is understandably so. Analysis is more cognitively complex, so it's something that they don't do as well. We also see, and this is now from a couple of semesters ago, but actually we see this across different classes, that our distribution of grades tends to get moved into the more successful side of the grades, where we reduce our DFWs and increase our success rates for our students post-implementation. DFW rates for my Gen Chem classes plummeted from going from a 25% when I first started here at St. Edward's University, now typically staying below 12% in my Gen Chem classes. And my argument is that students that at some point in the semester didn't feel themselves as eventually being successful are actually, because they have opportunities to get better, they're actually telling themselves or actually are believing in the idea that they actually can do better after they get another attempt. So I think they're retaining and ultimately succeeding. And just to show you that this is not just merely grade inflation as a result of the idea of multiple attempts, when we do independent exams of the students using the American Chemical Society standardized exam, we can see that the students in the classes that I was retaining at a higher level are performing just as well, or sometimes even better, at least nominally, than the students in courses that don't have necessarily mastery-based learning. So I am retaining at a higher level, and the students are performing just as high as students in other courses. So with that, I think I've said a ton, and I want to give an opportunity for us to have a quick conversation. And I will stop sharing the screen so I can open it up for everybody else. If that's the right format, correct, Chip?
Yep, absolutely. That's great. Thanks, Santiago. Do we have any questions or anything we want to talk about?
I have a quick question. So based on, it looks like your grading scheme ends with like a spreadsheet that has like 90 columns. Does that get a little bit overwhelming just to like manage the logistical side of this?
Actually, sorry about that. Actually, it doesn't, and I'm absolutely happy to share my grading sheet with it. It is pretty straightforward from the grading standpoint as I go through my assessments. Entering in the gradebook is basically 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, according to the different cognitive levels. So yeah, there's a lot of columns, I guess, but I'm happy to share the spreadsheet. It's super simple. Actually, I'm not really as talented as I should be with Excel, but it actually ends up feeding pretty well, and it works straightforward. For the students to keep track of this, because there's no really good learning management system that can handle this robustly, I've created a sort of cheapo also Excel sheet where I guide the students in how to enter their grades, basically as answering yes or no. They're putting ones and zeros in terms of whether they get it or not. And then the spreadsheet has a bunch of bar graphs that shows them proficiency according to the learning objectives. And that has worked pretty effectively. It's a very simple tool. And then the students are kind of tracking that. And then we have conversations about, this is what I have in my gradebook, what do you have in yours? And they're kind of at least being aware of what they know and what they don't know from that perspective. But that's a great question. It is a little bit of a learning curve there. Thank you, Taylor.
Go, Anthony.
Hi, Santiago. That was really wonderful. So I have 2 questions. One, I just want to make sure that I understand what the concept or when you use the word mastery, that I understand what that term means in this context. And then my second question, which I'll just say, is that how does this work if you had potentially a homework assignment? Does that mean that you would have to grade every question separately if there were multiple student learning objectives on a single assignment, and then you'd have to break those scores out individually?
Yeah, so that would be potentially the case for the second question. So addressing the second question, if you have a homework assignment that has multiple learning objectives within it, yes, I think that the way that and I originally started this way, my assignments were lots of questions from different learning objectives, but they were categorized. So SLO 1.1 and it had a category, SLO 1.2 and it had a category. The idea was to be as explicit as possible to the students to show them where the content was coming from. Now what I'm doing currently is that I do it everything in a package. So I don't move past the objective until everything has been completed, the homework and the assessments and everything. So the first attempt at the assessment plus the homework has to be all within the boundaries of the first objective before I move it into the second objective. And I know that that might not be practical for some people that have sort of a mixture of objectives, but if you have that, then yes, it would have to be sort of graded according to each of the objectives and then turn that into the grade book. I did that initially. I'm just more disaggregating that. When I mean mastery, to the first question that you ask, I mean the idea of earning proficient, sort of getting proficiency with the material, meaning meeting the objective itself. Because the objectives are written with a particular outcome in mind, the idea is whenever they succeed at the assessment task, in that case, the student has reached the mastery or proficiency with the outcomes, how I mean it.
So I could use a little help on this one. So how do you get, if a student passes or shows mastery with the first assessment in something, when is a student taking a third one if they didn't? Like, how does that all?
Nice. So yeah, in terms of the structure of how we go about doing that, so you can think about it like quizzes, exam days, and final exam. That would be sort of my 3 instances for doing that. So let's say, for example, I'm about to finish SLO 1.1 in my inorganic class, and those were 3 days of class. At the end of those 3 days, they're going to get their first attempt at the assessment. And that's their first checkpoint. When my exam time, my first exam would have come along, which usually includes 3 learning objectives, that's when they get the second attempt. And then when they get to the final exam, that is their third attempt at that same learning objective. So it's the final exam when they finally get to see it for one more attempt at trying to do that. Does that make sense in terms of the flow? Does that address the question?
Yeah, I was worried that you were like giving exams every minute of every day.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of people that are actually implemented some of this, and they have people that come into office hours picking assessments and doing things like that, and that's incredibly overwhelming. I actually used to do 5 attempts, and after trying that for like a year or so, I had to hone it in, because what was happening is that the students were not taking the first 3 attempts seriously, so they were just blowing off the first 3 attempts, and then in the 4th and 5th, maybe they were trying hard, but it was kind of a waste of time for everybody because nobody was really taking it seriously. Whereas 3 attempts has become sort of a sweet spot where the first one might be a little bit of a blow off maybe, but then the second one is much more serious. And then of course the final becomes but the final is no longer this gigantic, heavy 20% monster, but instead is just another opportunity to get better. So the students can come into the final, let's say with a C, and they can say, sorry, I don't need to get past this. I got my proficiency, and they sign the final and they leave. Or they can say, I actually want to get better, and they could achieve eventually potentially an A if a student actually gets the mastery at that point.
Do you get the students that are like looking for the Hail Mary mastery on the final where they need, I need to master 10 things somehow?
Certainly, yeah, certainly. And in some cases, it's definitely been the case that they simply don't get it, but it also has been the case that they have been, since the drop date for us, we have a fairly late drop date, they have begun to start the process of like talking to me and having more meaningful encounter with the material. And I have seen students moving from a D to a C, D to a B, which is wonderful to see, right? Because they actually started really honing in and getting focused. So I've seen both scenarios, yeah.
Okay. We have a quick question from the chat here from Shirley. They're kind of related. Have you seen pushback from students, and are there learners that just don't buy into the structure?
Yes, certainly. When I first started, the pushback was really, really hard. I think that the biggest piece of pushback, however, was on my credit, no credit mechanism. When I have a colleague that has implemented a no credit, partial credit, somewhat credit, and then full credit, that for him has completely gone away in terms of the pushback. So I still have lingering pushback in terms of the credit, no credit, but there's overwhelming support for the idea that finally I have opportunities to get better. The instructor actually cares about the things that I learn. So learning is at the focus of the feedback that I'm receiving from students, which is what I was hoping for. Like I said, if you implement any sort of partial credit in between structure, it seems to dissipate that idea. I just haven't implemented that in my class. I'm dealing with the pushback normally, but it's also about training, not training, but trying to help the students understand how it works and why is it useful this way? Why is it important that they actually get it right rather than partially right? It's not quite a touchdown if you don't catch the ball kind of thing. The analogy might not be a good translation, but that's the type of thinking.
Go ahead, Mary. I think that was a hand wave.
Hey, thanks. I'm going to remember to unmute this time. I'm just curious to know what you use for homework. If you use any publisher supplied homework, which have these built-in mastery components, and what you're doing there.
Yeah, for general chemistry, I use a publisher provided online homework system. So that's where the 80% comes in, whereas like basically that's the level that they have to achieve, and then I use that as credit in my gradebook. For organic chemistry and inorganic chemistry, I use my own generated homework, so I grade it manually because I have smaller classes and I can do that and provide a little bit more feedback there.
So, I have similar system, and with those online homeworks, they're very sort of checkable and gameable. And so it's not, I do the same thing where I give full credit I give at 90, and I actually did that mainly because of, so I don't have to get into like, it didn't accept the way I entered it, formatting kind of issues, but I like this idea of just, setting the threshold even lower for the reasons you mentioned. So I like that idea, but I'm also aware that their successful completion of that homework doesn't necessarily mean a lot, depending on if they've just gamed it or if they've actually done it.
Yeah, and that was partially the motivation behind trying to set the point credit associated with the homework as low as 0.5, where it's something because I'm trying to give them credit for the work they're doing, but helping them recognize that this is purely formative. You had multiple attempts at getting this. This is for you to ask questions and engage with the material. And then the big stuff becomes when you come and try to do the assessment. So you're right. I think it's hard to get around a little bit of that.
Yeah. And I think at the beginning level, it takes students a year or two into their education before they understand that concept of that it's about the learning. So
and the earlier we do it, I think the better. I think 100%. Like they put it in their hands and showing them what it means to be formative versus summative, and those distinctions is language that we should be used, that I like using in my classroom for my students. Yeah.
I'll just jump in. I don't know if anybody saw my hand up. So I got two kind of questions. First off is, does everything that you do pass kind of the sniff test? Like, has there ever been anything that seemed way out of whack? As opposed to like a traditional grading scale where you'd think that, oh, that student, you kind of get the feel for your students where you can kind of guess what they're by the end of the semester, what their outcome might be on the final.
So you mean like, do I see like a crazy surprise where it's like, whoa, what happened here?
Yeah. Or have you ever been like, wow, how did that student get an A? Like, I would not guess that they could answer any of these questions if asked on the street or something like that.
Okay, that's a great point. I have not seen that. I have not seen like, oh my gosh, how did that happen? A little bit of actually, okay, let's super honest with it. When we went crazy on COVID in the middle of the spring, I saw a little bit of that because even my mechanisms to implement proctoring and all those things were kind of weak. So that's the only time that I've seen that. Prior to that, there were a lot of, I know the student has been working. I've seen him in my office hours. We've been working together. I've seen more meaningful engagement. And sure enough, there was a jump. And that was more as a result of what I was noticing from their engagement. So a little bit of, I guess it does pass the sniff test in that sense.
Gotcha. I guess I'd proct another question. Do you think that just that engagement is what helps lift the students? And then the second thing is I noticed that, and I don't remember where the data was coming from, but I saw that your W group kind of went up a little bit post. Can you comment on that, or was that just an anomaly?
I think it's an anomaly, anecdotally. I think that the Ws are kind of all over the place and for here at St. Ed's, medical leaves and different things that we've had in the past. So I think those are a little bit not quite a good measurement. But to your first point, I absolutely think is about the engagement. Multiple engagements, repeated engagement with the material, as we know, that is proven to be useful and successful. The fact that they do the homework, let's say at 60%, and I say, hey, use a token and try to get to 80%. gives them this motivation to try to do it again. And I give them 48 hours to engage with that homework. So it's not like I give them infinite time to come back to that homework, but it's kind of an immediate idea. Or let's say that something happened and they didn't do the homework, and I say, hey, you have 48 hours to get to it. So the idea that they have to try it again and again. And then on the, let's say the point of the exams and final exams, if I give the students, if we do a traditional point system, a student gets to an exam and they're trying to maximize and push as many points as they can with the things that they know to get to the highest grade possible, and then they go for the things that they don't know. Whereas in this system, the things that they know have been given credit, so they're in the past. But the things that they don't know is the things that they are now motivated to hopefully tackle. So to some extent, I'm trying to incentivize, why don't you work on the things you don't understand yet? And maybe you can get a little bit more credit and lift up your grade. So that helps a little bit too.
Gotcha. Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? I did just drop a link in for a brief survey, just kind of review, give us some feedback on today's SLiTHER, which we always greatly appreciate.
So we have Kyle, I think.
Yeah, just thinking about, going about implementing this. Did you have trouble like assigning the SLOs and their specific levels for each of those SLOs as you were creating this approach?
Yes. As I said, prior to the 2017 pub, when we started thinking about grading, we started working on the learning objective mapping to cognitive levels with Marzano back in 2013 or 2012. The initial pub that came out on that in 2015 had 21 learning objectives for general chemistry. So you can imagine, the difficulties of going from that massive amount of content that we all know we have, and then trying to hone in, trying to figure out what level is what level. So that's taking several years of iterations and colleagues back and forth of us kind of thinking together and saying, is this really what we mean by analysis? The book by Marzano that actually focuses on the writing of learning objectives has beautiful summaries of how to think about those cognitive levels in a summarized way. And I have some handouts and tools that I can also provide that actually is really beautiful to go with your colleagues to sort of think about. When I asked this question, what am I really meaning? Two things that we found. First, that we were sort of miscategorizing things all over the place, right? Things that we thought were like analysis or hard were often questions that we were basically already introducing in class high level, and we were asking them again in the assessment, which no longer qualifies as analytical thinking because it's not a unique creation of the student. It's now repeating what you already said. And the second thing we realized is that a lot of our assessments or questions were combining multiple objectives and mushing them into one, which is wonderful, I think, for different types of courses potentially, or for if you explicitly tell the students that you're going to be mixing learning objectives. But it became cognitively too much for some students that were unable to discern. And more importantly, the feedback on that particular question was useless for the instructor and the student because the student didn't know was it the concept they didn't get, was it the math, was it stoichiometry that they didn't get. So you have multiple layers of information, and the student at the end leaves empty-handed, and so does the instructor, understanding what did I actually miss in that question, and I think disaggregating that it's a lot of time and not impossible. Absolutely, I think that there's some tools out there. I can help too. Yeah.
I'm gonna speak for everyone because I hope they're thinking what I'm thinking. I think if we could take your slides from today and post them as a 5 slides about on Viper, and then you add to that any of these materials that you would be willing to, I think the community would really appreciate seeing that. So rather than you sending out a whole bunch of individual emails, we could put it all in one place. And I think...
Yeah, that'd be a good LO.
Yeah,
okay,
I think
perfect.
I'm speaking for a lot of people, and I hope I'm not out of place, but...
So it's been a little bit since I did the LO, but it will be right below the 5 slides, they will be right below. I'll put the supplemental documents, right?
Yep. There's links and attachments and everything. Yep.
Perfect. I would absolutely commit to doing that. That sounds fun. That sounds great.
That would be awesome.
Yeah. Happy to help in any way, talking to people, working with your department, talking about individual things in your classes. Absolutely super happy to do that.
Yeah.
Let me know.
And let us know if you need help getting the LO up or anything.
We know people.
Thank you, Anthony.
Yeah, and then as soon as you go submit it, just go shoot me a quick email. I'll go in and I'll grab it
Okay.
straight away. So,
And then when it's up, then you'll have a place you can always just link to, and if people ask about it, and say, "Hey, here it is." And
Okay.
share
Perfect.
the link.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I've been personally disconnected a little bit from our Viper community, but I'm really happy that Carrie brought me in, and Chip and all of you guys. So thank you for the opportunity. Ready to get back on board.
Well, we're glad to have you back.